There is something happening inside you that most people will never understand. You walk into a room, and within seconds, you've already felt the tension no one else noticed. You've already read the expression someone tried to hide. You've already sensed the unspoken thing hanging in the air, the thing nobody said, but everybody felt. And yet you stay quiet. Not because you have nothing to say, but because what's happening inside you is so vast, so layered, so difficult to compress into ordinary words, that speaking feels like a betrayal of the experience itself. You feel everything, and you say very little. And the world has probably made you feel like something is wrong with you because of that. Maybe you've been called mysterious, or cold, or too sensitive. Maybe someone told you to just speak up or stop overthinking, as if the depth you experience is a malfunction that needs to be corrected, as if your silence is absence rather than the most full, most inhabited space in the room. But here is what psychology actually says about people like you. You don't have a problem. You have a profile. One of the rarest, most misunderstood, and most quietly powerful psychological profiles that exists. And today, we're going to break it down, not to flatter you, but to finally give you the language for something you've been living without explanation for your entire life. Let's start with the feeling itself. There's a concept in psychology called emotional granularity, the ability to distinguish between emotions with precision and nuance. Most people experience emotion in broad strokes. Happy, sad, angry, fine. They move through their feelings the way someone schemes a headline, quickly on the surface, without much examination. But people like you don't skim. You read every word. You feel the difference between loneliness and solitude, between disappointment and grief, between admiration and longing. Your emotional vocabulary, even if it lives entirely inside you, is extraordinarily rich. Research from Harvard psychologist Susan David shows that high emotional granularity is directly linked to psychological resilience, better decision-making, and greater mental clarity under pressure. The people who can name what they feel with precision are the people who are least controlled by their emotions, because they understand them. You feel everything deeply not because you are weak, but because your inner architecture is more refined. Now here's where it gets fascinating. The silence, the restraint, the way you hold so much and release so little. This is not emotional suppression. This is something entirely different. And the distinction matters enormously. Suppression is when you push something down because it frightens you. You avoid the feeling. You bury it. You pretend it isn't there. What you do is different. You hold the feeling. You turn it over. You examine it from every angle before you decide what, if anything, deserves to be said. You are not avoiding the emotion. You are processing it at a level of depth that most people simply don't have access to. Psychologists call this affective depth combined with expressive restraint, and it is one of the defining features of highly intuitive, deeply introspective personalities. Think of it like this. Most people are rivers, constantly moving, always visible, always making noise. But you are more like an ocean, still on the surface, unimaginably deep below it. And just because you can't see the movement doesn't mean nothing is happening. Everything is happening, constantly. There's another dimension to this that most people never consider. People who feel deeply but speak carefully tend to be extraordinarily attuned to nonverbal truth. The things people communicate without words, the micro-expressions, the slight shift in posture, the way someone laughs a little too quickly, the silence after a question that should have had an easy answer. You notice these things automatically, not because you're suspicious or paranoid, but because your nervous system has always been calibrated to the full frequency of human experience, not just the edited version people choose to present. This is sometimes called empathic accuracy, the ability to correctly infer what another person is thinking or feeling. Studies show that individuals with high empathic accuracy are not just more emotionally intelligent. They are better communicators, better leaders, and more deeply trusted by the people around them. Here's the irony. The quietest person in the room is often the one who understands a room most completely. Your silence isn't distance. It's perception. Let's talk about something that might feel uncomfortably familiar. You probably spent a significant amount of your life feeling overstimulated by ordinary experience. A conversation that others found casual left you exhausted. A film that most people forgot by morning stayed with you for days. Music hits you somewhere that feels almost physical. Art reaches inside you and rearranges something. This is not hypersensitivity in the clinical, fragile sense. This is what psychologist Elaine Aron spent decades studying and eventually named high sensitivity, a trait found in roughly 15 to 20% of the population, present in over 100 animal species, and consistently linked to deeper cognitive processing of sensory and emotional information. Highly sensitive people don't just experience the world, they absorb it, and that absorption requires recovery. It requires silence. It requires solitude, not as escape, but as recalibration. The introversion many of you feel is not a social failure. It is a biological necessity for a nervous system that processes at a higher resolution than most. You need quiet because you are always already full. Now we arrive at the paradox that defines your entire experience. You feel more than almost anyone around you, and yet the people who know you might describe you as hard to read, difficult to reach, impossible to fully know. How does that happen? How does someone who feels everything become someone who seems so unknowable? The answer lies in something called the depth of processing paradox. When the inner world is rich enough, complex enough, layered enough, it becomes genuinely difficult to translate. Not because you don't want to connect, but because the translation itself feels like a loss. Like trying to describe a dream in the language of waking life. The words exist, but they don't quite fit. And so you stay quiet, not out of withdrawal, but out of a kind of integrity, a refusal to reduce something true and complex into something convenient and shallow. This is one of the most misunderstood things about people with your profile. Your silence is not rejection. It is respect. Respect for the depth of your own experience. And often, a quiet hope that someone will one day be patient enough to meet you inside it. There is one more thing I want you to understand. Throughout history, the people who change the way humanity thinks, the philosophers, the artists, the scientists, the quiet revolutionaries, were almost never the loudest voices in the room. They were the observers, the ones who sat at the edge of the conversation and watched, the ones who felt the texture of the world so fully that they eventually had to create something in order to release it. Your depth is not ornamental. It is functional. It is the engine of insight, creativity, and genuine understanding. The world has always needed people who feel before they speak, who think before they act, who sit with uncertainty long enough to actually understand it, rather than filling the silence with noise just to feel less alone. The noise is everywhere. People who can hold the silence are rare. You are that rare. So let me leave you with this. The next time you feel the weight of your own depth, the exhaustion of absorbing everything, the frustration of being misunderstood, the loneliness of living in an inner world that most people will never see, remember what that depth actually is. It is not a burden you failed to shed. It is a capacity you were given. The same sensitivity that makes you cry at music you've heard 100 times is the same sensitivity that makes you see people more clearly than they see themselves. The same quietness that makes others think you're distant is the same quietness that allows you to listen, truly listen, in a way that most people are too full themselves to manage. You feel everything deeply and you say very little. And somewhere right now, someone desperately needs exactly that. Not more noise, not more performance. Just someone who feels what is real and honors it with silence until the right words finally arrive. That is not a weakness. That has always been a gift. If this reached something in you that you've never quite had words for before, stay with that feeling. You don't have to share it. You don't have to explain it. Just let yourself be known, even if only to yourself, for exactly what you are. That's enough. That has always been enough.